Okay, just wait a little bit to make sure that we are in fact live. Are we live? Is it working? Looks like we are live. Yes. Welcome back, history seekers, to another episode of Fistory. Tonight, the Black Death. Possibly, I think, probably the most calamitous event to ever befall Europe. An event written into the hearts, minds, and even genomes of the European mind. If you believe in such a thing as ancestral memory, the Black Death lurks deep in the ancestral memory of Europe. A plague so devastating that it may have actually killed 50% of Europe's population. The truth is, no one really knows. It's not like back then they sort of had, Europe-wide bureaucracies, but the sort of general consensus is that it was, between 30 and 60%. One of the things that you generally notice with sort of mass death events of these kinds is that once the deaths get to like a certain size, they just become sort of really incomprehensible to the mind. And so people will sort of later on say, oh, yeah, like 50% of the population or 30% of the population or, this many million or, whatever. But no one can really grasp those kind of numbers because no one person knows millions of people. So it just, it just becomes this sort of like abstract thing. But the Black Death was an incredibly significant event in European history. 1348 to about 1352, I believe. Around that period, the plague came, destroyed Europe, and then sort of left as quickly as it came. It came from the east, from Crimea, maybe China, maybe Africa, and no one really knows precisely where it originated. What they do know is that it first struck the Middle East and then moved to Crimea, and then from Crimea moved into Europe proper, striking sort of cities with its deadly taint, and produced a lot of this kind of artwork. One of the interesting things about the Black Death is that because writing was like very well established by this point, there are still quite a few contemporary records. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that the modern mind is like, so yes, we can't take what these medieval people said at face value. They said all of these things about like strange lights in the sky and weird omens, and obviously we can't believe any of that, and it had to have been caused by this one thing that we can understand. This is one of my major sort of beefs with what they call, I think, historiography, where they go back and they recontextualize sort of like old stuff in the frame of the modern world, because people assume in the modern world that the medieval world was basically exactly the same. That the only real difference is the cognitive framing of the people who were there. But that's not. I don't really know whether that's true. I can't prove this, obviously, but I wondered to myself whether the age of things like great miracles, great disasters, what we would call, the supernatural, sort of like broadly, right? Which is a kind of, it was a very, very modern word, right? You wouldn't really have had a word like that back in medieval times because it was so in your face, and everyone, well, either erroneously believed it if you take the modern view, or they just saw it everywhere if you sort of take the medieval view. I sometimes wonder whether there's not some like strange cycle that moves through time where these sort of mystical events, or miracles, and great malices come and go, and the one of the reasons why we had the modern age is that we live in a sort of plateau where these forces were like greatly reduced. Maybe it's something from the sun, or I don't know, or just right, like now obviously I am not a history professor. Indeed, this is just going to be like an hour sort of just covering this thing. Whereas you could literally do several PhD courses on the Black Death itself and its effects throughout Europe and all this kind of other stuff. This is just designed to be just a little bit of a taster, just a sort of, summary. And I'm going to read some contemporary sources because I really prefer to actually read stuff in the words of the people who were there. And as I was saying, the modern people are always like basically sort of censoring or editing these things and saying, oh, those silly medieval people, they didn't know what they were talking about. Well, I don't know, man. When you read some of these stuff, they seemed like at least as intelligent as the people living today, if not more so. So, I don't know. Before we get into it, you can please, if you want to send super chats or anything like that, you can link through Entropy or through Ko-Fi. Linkies in the chat. And we already have like one amazingly huge super chat. Mark Zia for $50 US. God, thank you so much, mate. May you have a better new year than 1358. It could hardly be worse. Really, you could probably clock 1358 as like the worst year to ever befall Europe. Anyway, let's get into it, shall we? I've got some other lovely. I mean, just look at the artwork that this period produced, right? Memento Mori, the sort of the use of death and skeletons in a lot of Christian art came out of the Black Death. This idea that time was short, you could be called back to God at any moment. Do not participate in the vanity of this world. You will pass very quickly. All is dust, all is vanity. Of course, this was not, as we will see later, the view of necessarily everyone who lived in this time. Some people, locked themselves away. Others were like, basically, screw it. They went out and like partied their asses off, presumably like, well, if God is going to take me, then he's going to take me. It's very, very interesting just actually to study the mass psychology that affected people. But anyway, we'll get into like a bit of background. This is Encyclopedia Britannica. I cannot help but feel that it has degraded significantly in quality. I should try and rustle up an older version of this. But anyway, the Black Death was a pandemic that ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, taking a proportionally greater toll of life than any other known epidemic or war up to that time. It is estimated that 25 million people died. Again, it's an estimate, right? Like, no one really knows. The Black Death is widely believed to have been the result of plague caused by infection with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Modern genetic analysis indicate that the strain of Y. pestis introduced during the Black Death is ancestral to all extant circulating Y. pestis strains known to cause disease in humans. Y. pestis is just the plague, basically. Hence, the origin of modern plague epidemics lies in the medieval period. Other scientific evidence has indicated that the Black Death may be viral in origin. Now, this is quite interesting. If you compare and contrast this to Wikipedia, which of course is written by the right people with the right opinions, bros, they basically state it sort of absolutely factually, right? There is no room for debate that the Black Death was caused by the plague. Of course, the plague is transmitted by fleas. The Chinese rat flea, I believe, is the sort of etiological agent. However, there are some sort of problems with this explanation, to be quite frank. Not to mention the speed of transmission and the sort of some of the accounts from the period that really seem to be describing an airborne disease of like quite high virility. There are also questions of how it managed to travel across on ships, if it was so deadly, if it had such a short incubation rate, everyone would have died. This is Yersinia pestis, the plague, basically. Bubonic plague is what most people call it, although there are three main forms. There's the pneumonic, the septicemic, and the bubonic. So the bubonic is where you get sort of swollen lymph nodes, buboes, usually appearing on the groin, at the junction between the thigh and the groin. There's a lot of like lymph nodes there, or under the armpit. These are like incredibly painful. And if they become sort of, they start suppurating and they bleed pus, then you're likely to survive. If they harden, you are likely to die. There is also a version, the septicemic plague, where it gets into the blood, and that's like very deadly, and the pneumonic version, where it gets into your lungs and you're dead very, very quickly. So there is some debate over this. Most notably, this paper from 2005 from Duncan and Scott, excuse me, who postulate that the plague may have in fact been caused by a viral hemorrhagic fever, basically Ebola, with a very long incubation period, which allowed it to spread widely, even with the limited transport of the Middle Ages. Now, this is the question, right? Transport in the Middle Ages took a very, very long time. Once sort of the plague broke out, anyone who was, sort of like seen to be suffering would not be let anywhere near a town or a ship. And so these people sort of theorized that what was going on is that there was a very, very long incubation period, up to like 32 days. So you'd get it, for a week you'd have it, but you wouldn't be infectious. And then for a couple of weeks afterwards, you'd be infectious, but you'd show no symptoms. And that's how it spread so quickly among the population, because the quarantine measures weren't properly working. It is suggested that hemorrhagic plague emerged from its animal host in Ethiopia and struck repeatedly at European and Asian civilizations before appearing as the Black Death. The CCR532 mutation confers protection against HIV-1 in an average of 10% of people of European origin today. It is suggested that all the CCR5 alleles originated from a single mutation event that occurred before 1000 BC, and the subsequent epidemics of hemorrhagic plague gently forced its frequency up during the time of the Black Death. Epidemics of hemorrhagic plague over the next 3 centuries then steadily raised the frequency in Europe, but not elsewhere to present-day value. So basically, right, they're saying that there's this specific genetic allele that was a result of the Black Death, and those people that had this particular mutation were more likely to survive. And as the plague outbreak kept going on and on and on, the frequency of this genetic mutation in the general population begin to rise up. So I'll just read a little bit from this, because I always really, really liked this paper. Immediately on its arrival in 1347 in the port of Messina in Sicily, the Great Pestilence, or Black Death, as it was named in 1823, because of the black blotches caused by subcutaneous hemorrhages that appeared on the skin of the victim. Subcutaneous hemorrhage is basically a bruise. You start sort of like bleeding through the skin. Underneath the skin, right? The way a bruise does. Now, the thing is, bruises are very different to buboes, right? The swellings, and accounts of this suggest that, it might have been multiple diseases going around at the same time. Europe was having a very, very bad year. The black blotches caused by subcutaneous hemorrhages that appeared on the skin of the victims was recognized as a directly infectious disease. Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar who wrote 10 years after the Black Death had arrived, said, quote, that the infection spread to everyone who had any intercourse with the disease. Indeed, they believed that priests who heard the confessions of the dying were immediately overcome by death, so that some even remained in the rooms of the dying. Case mortality was 100%. That's very, very, very high. They realized that safety lay in fleeing, but this very effectively served only to spread the infection. The Black Death moved as a wave northwards through Europe at an average speed of about 4 kilometers per day and reached the Arctic Circle by 1350. Remarkable progress in the days of very limited means of transport. Even more impressively, it had earlier appeared in Asia Minor and the Crimea and moved south to Antioch. It was present in the Levant and spread along the northern African coastlands and to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, covering in all some 7 million square kilometers. When it had burnt itself out, some 40% of the population had been killed. This outbreak was a pandemic on a scale never before experienced or since. But this unknown disease had not disappeared completely, and there were epidemics scattered throughout Europe during the 1350s. Thereafter, the plague was permanently established in France, with epidemics every year that cycled around the main trading routes. From there, infected travelers carried the disease by road and river across the continental landmass and by sea to Britain and Ireland. But all these peripheral epidemics died out completely and were restarted by fresh infections coming in from the focus in France. The epidemics progressively increased in spread, frequency, and ferocity, with a pronounced rise after 1550 because transport improved and the population of the towns steadily grew. Contemporary accounts, pattern of spread, and mortality all confirm that the same pathogen was responsible for all the plagues, including the first strike of the Black Death. Now, one of the reasons why these guys say this is that quarantine was invented because of the Black Death. I believe quarantine means 5 days. So if you were trying to get into a city, you had to stay in a quarantine area for 5 days. Or was it 15? It's 5 or 15 days. No, 40 days. Pardon me. Right. It was a 40-day quarantine. Pardon me. And then if you showed any symptoms during those 40 days. Now, 40 days is a very, very long time. And it suggests to me that the people in the city realized, that there was a sort of long incubation period, that people could be infected for quite a long time and not show any symptoms. If you think about something like the flu, for example, a 5 or 7 day quarantine would be effective because no one's going to not be showing symptoms if they're infected by that point. Even in the 14th century, the health authorities in northern Italy had established the importance of a 40-day quarantine period, which became the gold standard for continental Europe for the next 300 years. The 40-day quarantine was not adopted in England until the 16th century, and even then it was changed to 30 days, only to find that this was completely ineffective, whereupon this regulation was speedily rescinded. So interesting. Only a 40-day quarantine worked. This would also not work if it was being spread by fleas. Because you would have fleas in the quarantine area. The fleas would be sort of a local reservoir of the cats and the dogs and stuff like that. And people would keep getting reinfected. The complete success of the quarantine period confirms that the plague was a directly infectious disease, as opposed to being carried by a parasite. And it also shows that it had a long incubation period. Towns in France gradually realized that the danger lay in the arrival of an infected traveler who may well have come from a considerable distance. Entry was denied if they had come from a town that had suffered an epidemic. Later, in addition to inspecting travelers on arrival, the authorities also required proof that all the towns through which they had journeyed were completely free of the plague. Once an epidemic had erupted, those displaying symptoms were removed to emergency primitive isolation hospitals called pest houses, which were hurriedly erected outside the town. Once a plague case had been identified, the family was locked up in the house, the well-known cross was daubed on the door, and a watchman was appointed to stand guard. These measures were less successful in containing an epidemic because, as shown below, victims were more infectious before the appearance of the symptoms. So this is what I was saying before. There's a prodromal phase where you have the virus, you are infectious, but you show no symptoms. Anyone who's played Plague Incorporated will know what I'm talking about here. Despite only sketchy medical knowledge at the time, the epidemiology of the plague was fully understood at least by the middle of the 17th century. Daniel Defoe had perspicaciously noted that in the Great Plague of London in 1665, because of its infectious nature, the disease may be spread by apparently healthy people who harbor the disease, but have not yet exhibited the symptoms. Such a person was in fact a poisoner, a walking destroyer perhaps for a week or a fortnight before his death, who might have ruined those whom he would hazarded his life to save, breathing death upon them, perhaps his tender kissings and embracing of his own children. Clearly, they recognized that victims were infectious before the symptoms appeared, the lengthy duration of the incubation period, the necessity of a 40-day quarantine, and the dangers of droplet infection. But there were also many features of the epidemics that were mystifying, and they also clung to their beliefs in divine intervention, transmission via contaminated clothing and bedding, movements of the planets, and poisonous miasmas. So that's quite an interesting paper. I'll stick it in the chat if any of you guys would like to read it. This caused quite a buzz in epidemiology circles. Because there's, in sort of, in the people that know the science, the trusters in the science, everybody knows that the Black Death was caused by Siena pestis. It was the bubonic plague transmitted by fleas and all that kind of like other stuff. But I mean, it's a bit it's a bit dicey, basically, right? And so the idea is that it was purely infected fleas that spread this disease, and bubonic plague is still around today. You get like a few cases every year, but because it is susceptible to antibiotics, it's not really the issue that it once was. So let's read some contemporary sources, shall we? First thing that's interesting to note is that there was a big famine in 1315. I believe this might have coincided with one of the medieval cool periods. I really should have researched this. But there were famines. The 14th century was a terrible time. Right. So this is the bit that I really wanted to read. Boccaccio, the Decameron, the introduction, the onset of the Black Death as described by Giovanni Boccaccio, 1313 to 1375. Now, this is someone who was there in Florence, and again, as I said, modern people will be like, oh, we'll just ignore this bit and that bit, but I don't know. Excuse me, just let me take a sip of coffee. I say then that the years of the beatific incarnation of the Son of God had reached the tale of 1348, when in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all the cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence, which, whether disseminated by the influence of these celestial bodies, or sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath, by way of retribution for our iniquities, had its origins some years before in the East, whence, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so calamitously had spread into the West. In Florence, despite all that human wisdom and forethought could devise to avert it, as the cleansing of the city from many impurities by officials appointed for the purpose, the refusal of entrance to all sick folk, and the adoption of many precautions for the preservation of health, despite also humble supplications addressed to God, and often repeated both in public procession and otherwise by the devout, towards the beginning of the spring of the said year, the doleful effects of the pestilence began to be horribly apparent by symptoms that showed as if miraculous. I just also want to point out, in the back of their minds, right? Like, all the COVID people, and the vaccinators and the lockdowners, everyone who studied epidemiology, they read this kind of stuff, right? And in the back of their minds, they're always sort of basically thinking of either the Black Death or the 1918 Spanish flu. So they have a sort of very catastrophist mindset. The 1918 flu, of course, being the funniest one, because Dr. Fauci actually put his name to this paper where they found a bunch of like lung sections that were preserved in wax from 1918, and they cut them open to see if they could find copies of the flu virus. And what they found is that everyone had died from bacterial pneumonia. And what causes bacterial pneumonia? Dirty masks. So, yeah. We got another super chat. Mikey Bikey for $5, anti-pestilence funds. Thank you very much, Mikey Bikey. I will spend that on anti-pestilence beer. I have it on good authority that the best way to resist the pestilence is to have a nice hearty ale. Not such were they as in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death. But in men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called gavoccioli. Gavoccioli! It sounds like a kind of pasta. I'll have a spaghetti gavoccioli. Ew. Extra buboes on mine, please. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavocciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change. Black spots or livids making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, then minute and numerous. And as the gavocciolo had been and still were an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves, which maladies seem set entirely at naught, both the art of the physician and the virtue of physic. Indeed, whether it was that the disorder was of a nature to defy such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault, besides the qualified, there were now a multitude, both of men and of women, who practiced without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and being in ignorance of its source, failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were those that covered few, but almost all within 3 days from the appearance of these said symptoms, sooner or later died, and in most cases without any fever or other attendant malady. Now, this is interesting because this is not really a description of bubonic plague. Sure, bubonic plague has buboes, but a bubo is just really a heavily infected lymph node, right? Which is why you get them on the, on the groin and on the armpit where your lymph nodes are. The death within 3 days is very, very sudden. Bubonic plague takes longer than that. Of course, it is possible that it was a strain of bubonic plague that we're not aware of, some ancestral, highly virulent strain. But I'm just sort of pointing out that it's still open and up in the air, unless, of course, you're a believer and a truster in the science, in which case don't listen to anything that I say. Right? Science trusters. Moreover, the virulence of the pest was the greater, by reason the intercourse was apt to convey it to the sick to the whole, just as fire devours things dry or greasy when they are brought close to it. The evil went yet further, for not merely by speech or association with the sick was the malady communicated to the healthy, with consequent peril of common death, but any that touched the clothes of the sick, or aught else that had been touched or used by these, seemed thereby to contract the disease. Now, this suggests formite transmission, right? Not transmission by fleas. The fleas flee the corpse. They don't hang out on discarded clothes. They grow cold. Fleas seek heat. So this seems to describe some kind of viral infection. So marvelous sounds that with which I have to relate, that had not many, and I among them, observed it with my own eyes, I had hardly dared to credit it, much less to set it down in writing, though I had had it from the lips of a credible witness. Now, I just want to point out something here. Not only is this writing, I mean, I believe this is translated from medieval Latin into English, but not only is this writing sort of like quite complex and clearly written by an intelligent person, you can't tell me that back in these days they did not understand what a rumor was and how, hearsay spread by many mouths. I'd also want to point out that in Florence, it was a very, very Christian community. And one of the fundamental sins in Christianity is to bear false witness. So there's a sort of societal prescription against sort of, going around and saying, oh, yes, I saw this thing. Now, obviously, during times of plague, all kinds of like mass insanities result. But I'm just saying that to just disregard these primary sources as saying, oh, that couldn't possibly happen. Oh, we're so much more intelligent now, in my opinion, is a mistake. I say then that such was the energy of the contagion of the said pestilence, that it was not merely propagated from man to male. Man to male? I don't know what that means. But what is much more startling, it was frequently observed that things which had belonged to one sick or dead of the disease, if touched by some other living creature not of the human species, were the occasion not merely of sickening, but of an almost instantaneous death. Whereof my own eyes, as I said a little before, had cognizance, one day among others, by the following experience. This is just a fancy way of saying like I saw it myself. The rags of a poor man who had died of the disease being strewn about the open street, 2 hogs came thither, and after, as is their wont, no little trifling with their snouts, took the rags between their teeth and tossed them to and fro about their chaps, whereupon almost immediately they gave a few turns and fell down dead, as if by poison, upon the rags which in an evil hour they had disturbed. I presume this is one of the reasons why a lot of people thought that this was the work of poison. Many Jewish communities perished as a result of suspicion that the Black Death was a result of Jews poisoning the well. I cannot comment as to how true this was or not. There were a number of like trials. There was some torture involved, and they did extract confessions allegedly. But it's hard to say. This seems too huge to have just been caused by poison, quite frankly. I mean, it looks to me like some kind of, honestly, like just demonic orbital strike or something. I honestly don't know. It's insane. In which circumstances, not to speak of many others of a similar or even graver complexion, diverse apprehensions and imaginations were engendered in the minds of such as were left alive, inclining almost all of them to the same harsh resolution, to wit, to shun and abhor all contact with the sick and all that belonged to them, thinking thereby to make each his own health secure. Among whom there were those who thought that to live temperately and avoid all excess would count for much as a preservative against seizures of this kind. Wherefore they banded together, and dissociating themselves from all others, formed communities in houses where there were no sick, and lived a separate and secluded life, which they regulated with the utmost care, avoiding every kind of luxury, but eating and drinking moderately of the most delicate viands and the finest wines, holding converse with none but one another, lest tidings of sickness or death should reach them, and diverting their minds with music and such other delights as they could devise. Lockdowners, basically. The more things change, the more they say the same. One of the things that always really strikes me about reading like medieval sources is the modern man. They love to pretend, the communists especially, that we are a new form of man, right? That we are so much more rational now. No, humans haven't really changed. They really haven't changed all that much actually in 700, 800 years. Basically, exactly the same behaviors emerge. People would do well to remember that. So you had the lockdowners on one hand. Others, the bias of whose minds was in the opposite direction, maintained that to drink freely, frequent places of public resort, and take their pleasure with song and revel, sparing to satisfy no appetite, and to laugh and mock at no event, was the sovereign remedy for so great an evil, and that which they affirmed they also put into practice, so far as they were able, resorting day and night, now to this tavern, now to that, drinking with an entire disregard of rule or measure, and by preference making the houses of others as it were their inns, if they but saw in them aught that was particularly to their taste or liking, which they were readily able to do, because the owners, seeing death imminent, had become as reckless of their property as of their lives, so that most of the houses were open to all comers, and no distinction was observed between the stranger who presented himself and the rightful lord. Excuse me. Thus, adhering ever to their inhuman determination to shun the sick as far as possible, they ordered their life. In this extremity of our city's suffering and tribulation, the venerable authority of laws, human and divine, was abased and all but totally dissolved for lack of those who should have administered and enforced them, most of whom, like the rest of the citizens, were either dead or sick, or so hard bested for servants that they were unable to execute any office, whereby every man was free to do what was right in his own eyes. Caused anarchy, basically. Not a few there were who belonged to neither of the two said parties, but kept a middle course between them, neither laying the same restraint upon their diet as the former, nor allowing themselves the same license in drinking and other dissipations as the latter, but living with a degree of freedom sufficient to satisfy their appetite, and not as recluses. They therefore walked abroad, carrying in the hands flowers or fragrant herbs, or diverse sorts of spices, which they frequently raised to their noses, deeming it an excellent thing thus to comfort the brain with such perfumes, because the air seemed to be everywhere laden and reeking with the stench emitted by the dead and the dying and the odors of drugs. Now, again, the sort of general way that disease was explained back in these sort of times was the idea of a miasma or an evil smell. Um, and and that's how you got sick. This sort of tied in with the idea of the humors, the balancing of the five humors. If your humors were out of balance, but I suspect a lot of people, they probably just like carried herbs and stuff like that, because the entire like city would have stank of death and incense and just general like horrible stuff. Um, some, again, the most sound perhaps in judgment, as they were also the most harsh in temper of all, affirmed that there was no medicine for the disease superior or equal in efficacy to flight. Following which prescription, a multitude of men and women, negligent of all but themselves, deserted their city, their houses, their estates, their kinfolk, their goods, and went into voluntary exile, or migrated to the country parts, as if God, in visiting men with this pestilence, in requital of their iniquities, would not pursue them with his wrath wherever they might be, but intended the destruction of such alone as remained within the circuit of the walls of the city, or deeming perchance that it was now time for all to flee from it, and that its last hour had come. So, of course, this is the religious framing, that the pestilence was a punishment from God for not being religious enough, essentially. Of the adherents of these diverse opinions, not all died, neither did all escape. But rather there were of each sort, and in every place many that sickened, and by those who retained their health were treated after the example which they themselves while whole had set, being everywhere left to languish in almost total neglect. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbours was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how kinsfolk held aloof and never met, or but rarely. Sounds like modern London. Enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women, that in the horror therefore brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers. You hear about this in the modern West all the time now. It's interesting to note just how insanely much of an aberration this was regarded in Florence at the time. I guess they didn't have the benefits of diversity. More fool them. Wherefore the sick of both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource but in the charity of friends, and such few that there were, or the interest of servants, who were hardly to be had at high rates and on unseemly terms, and being moreover one and all men and women of gross understanding, and for the most part unused to such offices, they concerned themselves no further than to supply the immediate and expressed wants of the sick, and to watch them die, in which service they themselves not seldom perished with their gains. So, the price of servants went through the roof. People are trying to make a bit of money as a servant, and they died along with the people who hired them. In consequence of which dearth of servants and dereliction of the sick by neighbours, kinfolks, and friends, it came to pass, a thing perhaps never before heard of, that no woman, however dainty, fair, or well born she might be, shrank, when stricken with the disease, from the ministrations of a man, no matter whether he were young or no, nor or scrupled to expose to him every part of her body, with no more shame than if he had been a woman, submitting of necessity to that which her malady required, wherefrom perchance there resulted in after time some loss of modesty in such as recovered. Okay, so this is interesting. What he's basically saying is that you also got a kind of erotomania from people with the disease, whether this was a symptom or whether this was like, sort of due to the times and everyone's like, oh my God, right? Like it's the end of the world. Like, I may as well get laid. I am curious as to how this would work, quite frankly. I can't imagine sex while you have a bubo being very enjoyable. One of the things about the bubos is they swell up, and if you move at all, you get this incredible pain. So I'm not sure whether this is like a disease thing or whether this is just a general kind of like apocalyptic fervor. Besides which many succumbed, who with proper attendance would perhaps have escaped death. So that, what with the virulence of the plague and the lack of due attendance of the sick, the multitude of the deaths that daily and nightly took place in the city was such that those who heard the tale, not to say witnessed the fact, were struck dumb with amazement, whereby practices contrary to the former habits of the citizens could hardly fail to grow up among the survivors. It had been, as today it is still, the custom for the women that were neighbors and of kin to the deceased to gather in his house with the women that were most closely connected with him, to wail with them in common, while on the other hand his male kinfolk and neighbors, with not a few of the other citizens and a due proportion of the clergy according to his quality, assembled without in front of the house to receive the corpse. And so the dead man was borne on the shoulders of his peers, with funeral pomp of taper and dirge, to the church selected by him before his death. Which rites, as the pestilence waxed in fury, were either in whole or in a great part disused, and gave ways to other of a novel order. For not only did no crowd of women surround the bed of the dying, but many passed from this life unregarded, and few indeed were they to whom were accorded the lamentations and bitter tears of sorrowing relations. Nay, for the most part, their place was taken by the laugh, the jest, the festive gathering, observances which the women, domestic piety in large measure set aside, had adopted with very great advantage to their health. Few also were there whose bodies attended to the church by more than 10 or 12 of their neighbors, and those not the honorable and respected citizens, but a sort of corpse carriers drawn from the baser ranks, who called themselves beccini, and performed such offices for hire, would shoulder the bier. Man, they really don't get full stops in this. So this is quite interesting, because if you look at modern society, modern atomized man, the way they're like, oh my god, people were like dying and they didn't even have their family around them to like mourn them and carry them to the church. I cannot wonder what this author would think of the modern West. He would probably be horrified, quite frankly. Sades, do I have any more super chats or anything I need to read? I can't keep my eye on the chat and read this. This is very, very hard going. Oh, and it's just okay. It's nearly done. Sort of corpse carriers drawn from the baser ranks, who call themselves beccini, and perform such offices for hire, would shoulder the bier, and with hurried steps carry it, not to the church of the dead man's choice, but to that which was nearest at hand. Oh my God! With 4 or 6 priests in front, and a candle or two, or perhaps none. Nor did the priests distress themselves with too long and solemn an office, but with the aid of the beccini, hastily consigned the corpse to the first tomb which they found untenanted. The condition of the lower, and perhaps in great measure the middle ranks of the people, showed even worse and more deplorable. For, deluded by hope or constrained by poverty, they stayed in their quarters, in their houses, where they sickened by thousands a day, and being without service or help of any kind, were, so to speak, irredeemably devoted to the death which overtook them. Many died daily or nightly in the public streets. Of many others who died at home, the departure was hardly observed by their neighbors until the stench of their putrefying bodies carried the tidings. And what with their corpses and the corpses of others who died on every hand, the whole place was a sepulchre. Excuse me. It was the common practice of most of the neighbors, moved no less by fear of contamination by the putrefying bodies than by charity towards the deceased, to drag the corpses out of the houses with their own hands, aided perhaps by a porter, if a porter was to be had, and lay them in front of the doors, where anyone who made the round might have seen, especially in the morning, more of them than he could count. Afterwards they would have biers brought up, or in default planks whereupon they laid them, nor was it once, twice only, that one and the same bier carried 2 or 3 corpses at once, but quite a considerable number of such cases occurred. One bier sufficing for husband and wife, 2 or 3 brothers, father and son, and so forth. And times without number it happened that as 2 priests bearing the cross were on their way to perform the last office for someone, 3 or 4 biers were brought up by the porters in rear of them, so that whereas the priests supposed that they had but 1 corpse to bury, they discovered that there were 6 or 8 or sometimes more. Nor for all their number were their obsequies honoured by either tears or lights or crowds of mourners. Rather, it was come to this, that a dead man was then of no more account than a dead goat would be today. So that's Boccaccio, the Decameron, translated in 1921. So I guess that's why the language is so flowery. Again, it's quite interesting to sort of think that even in Florence, in the middle of the plague, they were still burying people, right? Like, you didn't get this sort of mass breakdown. I mean, you can imagine sort of, other places like, I guess, Africa or whatever, where they just, they would just like leave all the corpses, just to rot, basically. I think it's just a very, very European sort of tale, very, very interesting. Now we also have, excuse me, just let me check the Ko-Fi. No, we're good. We also have this from Procopius. No, wait, no, hang on. That's the plague of Justinian. Let me see. So these are just some like little snippets. Now where's this one? Sorry. Yes, here we go. Now this sort of details some of the omens that happened like around the time. This is taking longer than I thought. I might do a second episode on this, actually. So Jean de Venette was a Carmelite friar in Paris. He came from peasant stock, yet became a master of theology at the University of Paris. His chronicle of the period is highly respected by historians and provides much valuable information on the political and religious life of the 14th century. His account of the Black Death reflects an intimate understanding of its devastation. In 1348, the people of France and of almost the whole world were struck by a blow other than war. For in addition to the famine which I described in the beginning, and to the wars which I described in the course of this narrative, pestilence and its attendant tribulations appeared again in various parts of the world. In the month of August 1348, after Vespers, when the sun was beginning to set, a big and very bright star appeared above Paris towards the west. It did not seem, as stars usually do, to be very high above our hemisphere, but rather very near. As the sun set and night came on, this star did not seem to me, or to many other friars who were watching it, to move from one place. At length, when night had come, this big star, to the amazement of all of us who were watching, broke into many different rays, and as it shed these rays over Paris towards the east, totally disappeared and was completely annihilated. Whether it was a comet or not, whether it was composed of airy exhalations and was finally resolved into vapor, I leave to the decision of astronomers. It is, however, possible that it was a presage of the amazing pestilence to come, which in fact followed very shortly in Paris and throughout France and elsewhere, as I shall tell. All this year and the next, the mortality of men and women, of the young, even more than the old, in Paris and in the Kingdom of France, and also, it is said, in other parts of the world, was so great that it was almost impossible to bury the dead. So this is quite interesting. This a comet, some kind of like orbital impact. That'd make a great plot for like an anime or something like that. It's secretly like aliens like doing like a biological bombardment of the Earth or something. Someone should write that. People lay ill a little more than 2 or 3 days and died suddenly. He who was well on one day was dead the next, and being carried to his grave. Swellings appeared suddenly in the armpit or in the groin, in many cases both, and they were infallible signs of death. This sickness or pestilence was called an epidemic by the doctors. Nothing like the great numbers who died in the years 1348 and 1349 have been heard of or seen or read of in times past. This plague and disease came from association and contagion. For if a well man visited the sick, he only rarely evaded the risk of death. Wherefore, in many towns, timid priests withdrew, leaving the exercise of their ministry to such of the religious as were more daring. In many places, not 2 out of 20 remained alive. Holy crap. So high was the mortality at the Hotel Dieu in Paris that for a long time more than 500 dead were carried daily with great devotion in carts to the cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris for burial. A very great number of the saintly sisters of the Hotel Dieu, who, not fearing to die, nursed the sick in all sweetness and humility, rest in peace with Christ, as we may piously believe. This plague, it was said, began among the unbelievers, came to Italy, and then crossing the Alps reached Avignon, where it attacked several cardinals and took from them their whole household. Then it spread unforeseen to France through Gascony and Spain, little by little, from town to town, from village to village, from house to house, and finally from person to person. It even crossed over to Germany, though it was not so bad there as with us. During the epidemic, God, of his accustomed goodness, deigned to grant his grace, that however suddenly men died, almost all awaited death joyfully. Nor was there anyone who died without confessing his sins and receiving the Holy Viaticum. To the even greater benefit of the dying, Pope Clement VI, through their confessors, mercifully gave and granted absolution from penalty to the dying in many cities and fortified towns. Men died the more willingly for this, and left many inheritances and temporal goods to churches and monastic orders, for in many cases they had seen their close heirs and children die before them. Some said that this pestilence was caused by infection of the air and waters, since there was at this time no famine nor lack of food supplies, but on the contrary, great abundance. As a result of this theory of infected water and air as the source of the plague, the Jews were suddenly and violently charged with infecting wells and water and corrupting the air. The whole world rose up against them cruelly on this account. In Germany and in other parts of the world where the Jews lived, they were massacred and slaughtered by the Christians, and many thousands were burned everywhere indiscriminately. The unshaken constancy of the men and their wives was remarkable. For mothers hurled their children first into the fire that they might not be baptized, and then leapt in after them to burn with their husbands and children. Damn. It is said that many bad Christians were found who in a like manner put poison into wells. But in truth, such poisonings, granted that they actually were perpetrated, could not have caused so great a plague, nor have infected so many people. There were other causes, for example, the will of God, and the corrupt humors and evil inherent in the air and the earth. Perhaps the poisonings, if they actually took place in some localities, reinforced these causes. The plague lasted in France for the greater part of the years 1348 and 1349, and then ceased. Many country villages and many houses in good towns remained empty and deserted. Many houses, including some splendid dwellings, very soon fell into ruins. Even in Paris, several houses were thus ruined, though fewer here than elsewhere. After the cessation of the epidemic, pestilence, or plague, the men and women who survived married each other. There was no sterility among the men, but on the contrary, fertility beyond the ordinary. Pregnant women were seen on every side. Many twins were born, and even 3 children at once. But the most surprising fact is that children born after the plague, when they became of an age for teeth, had only 20 or 22 teeth, though before that time men commonly had 32 in their upper and lower jaws together. What the hell? Okay, that's fucking weird. What this diminution, pardon me, in the number of teeth signified, I wonder greatly, unless it be a new era resulting from the destruction of one human generation by the plague and its replacement by another. But woe is me, the world was not changed for the better, but for the worse by this renewal of population. For men were more avaricious and grasping than before, even though they had far greater possessions. They were more covetous and disturbed each other more frequently with suits, brawls, disputes, and pleas. Nor by the mortality resulting from this terrible plague inflicted by God was peace between kings and lords established. On the contrary, the enemies of the King of France and of the Church were stronger and wickeder than before, and stirred up wars on sea and on land. greater evils than before spread everywhere in the world, and this fact was very remarkable. Though there was an abundance of all goods, yet everything was twice as dear, whether it were utensils, food, or merchandise, hired helpers, or peasants and serfs, except for some hereditary domains which remained abundantly stocked with everything. Charity began to cool, and iniquity with ignorance and sin to abound. For few could be found in the good towns and castles who knew how or were willing to instruct children in the rudiments of grammar. So yes, this is from The Plague in France, from Richard Newell, the Chronicle of Jean de Venette, 1953. So I think I might have to do another part two on this. There's a lot more. There's a lot more here. God, I love reading these. It's like just looking back in time. It's amazing. And also we have to do something on what basically happened afterwards, which was the Black Death completely changed the sort of economic structure of Europe. In a large sort of sense, ended a lot of serfdom. You had wages for the peasants. The wages like rose, and prosperity sort of generally broke out. So it's interesting to note. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Yes, I will do a part two. Chat wants a part two. Well, chat, I am your servant. Of course, I will do a part two. I love reading these, honestly, right? Like, just it's just like looking back in time, and the language as well is so flowery. It really gives you sort of like brain a workout trying to like follow this kind of language. It's it's a lot a lot more detailed than sort of big snood, she 6'7", or like whatever passes for language in the current day. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming, everyone. I will be back next Monday then, on with part two, the Black Death part deux. I will also be on Discord and Dragons tonight if you would like to come along on Use the Unix channel. Thank you very much for the super chats, Mikey Bikey and Mark Z, who gave $50. That's amazing. I really need like a cheer sound effect. Thank you so much, mate. I really appreciate that. Good night, everyone, and I will see you next week. Oh wait, hang on. I've got to get the window open so I can like stop it. Good night.